Hello everyone, and welcome to the new episode of the Darktable. In this episode I would like to address some issues that affect new users, especially those who have previously used other applications and are now faced with new approach in the Darktable, that so-called scene-referred workflow. And in this new approach, three issues are very common. First one is that matching of raw files to the look of the JPEG output from camera as a starting point for editing is no longer used. Then the second one is the fact that the use of the curves as practiced in other applications is no longer recommended. So what are the alternatives? And the third question is how to deal with the loss of contrast, especially in the highlights caused by the compression of the dynamic range. So let's start with the first question. Many raw image development software offer the possibility to adjust the appearance of the raw file to the appearance of the JPEG image produced by the camera as starting point for developing of the photo. And Darktable has so-called base curve, which, if activated in the settings, is applied automatically. However, this is the part of the so-called display referred workflow, which is no longer recommended as standard workflow because there's much more modern one that is preferred. In this so-called scene referred workflow, the base curve is no longer applied for the technical reasons. And what are those reasons? Please read in the documentation in the Darktable. We don't have too much time in this episode. In this video, I would like to address some others. So let's start with this photo. We need first to disable Filmic and find the base curve and apply it. That is the camera Nikon 7200, yes. And as you can see, the photo looks already quite nice. I only need to add some saturations, contrast, brightness, saturation. And I'm using, of course, modules for display referred workflow. Something like that, and those last step, local contrast, and you're practically done. And what that means with the display workflow is following. I need to go a bit back with my photo. I can show you. Now your starting point is the base curve here. So the base curve gives you some look, applies some curve, and this is the starting point. You make some adjustments here, but every other development is on the upper side here, goes up and ends with output color profile. Okay, let's try another one. Here we have a grandma chilling in the park. We need to disable Filmic, add base curve, and saturation. I don't know, maybe a little less contrast. No, let's leave it there, and local contrast, and we're done. Really quick, few steps. We have only added a bit contrast, saturation and local contrast, and we had finished with our photo. So the next one. Okay, disable Filmic, base curve, and here we are a bit tight with our dynamic range. So let's try add saturation, contrast, and brightness. Maybe go a bit back with the contrast. Okay, maybe something like that. And add a with exposure. Okay, it works. It's not too bad. So last step, local contrast. Oh, I think I have it here, and it looks quite nice also. So the next one. So same as before, disable Filmic, add base curve. Bam. Uh-oh, and we are on the edge. Let's see what happens if I add tiny bit of exposure. And now I need to find some solution for that black, for that dark shadows here. Maybe tone curve. Let's see. And we go here, try to go on the edge. So it will be really tricky. I must say I didn't use the curves for a long time, so I'm quite sure many of you will be much better there, but I don't want to lose too much time on fiddling with the points here. Try to find some quick solution, something like that. Okay, let's try to add some local contrast, maybe saturation. We can also use tone curve, but this time allow independent channels, because we can now add saturation here also. So let's do that. A and B channel. And I think that is, I can live with that. Maybe a bit less exposure and whatever. Doesn't look perfect, but it's okay. And now the last one, disable Filmic. And since this is not my photo, I need to see what kind of camera is used here. Canon. Okay, base curve. I hope we have some Canon EOS like and Canon EOS alternative. I will say this one is okay, but we are overboard here, so we need to go to exposure, bring the exposure down, and maybe even a bit more. Something like that. Maybe I will use tone curve also to improve it a little bit, not too much. I think we can go a bit more with the contrasts in the highlights, and I don't know, remove a bit there. I don't think we need much more here. So add saturation. Like that, and a local contrast, and we are done. We are a bit overboard here, but I think it's not so dramatic. Let's see. Okay, something like that. Now let's analyze our photos a little bit more. So let me disable this base curve to be able to analyze our situation a bit more. And as you can see, if I disable everything that I've done except exposure, we have quite a low dynamic range here on this photo. This photo is quite flat, and base curve needs a lot of dynamic range, as you can see. That is also the case for this one. If I disable everything what we have done, we are only using practically the half of our dynamic range for that. And in this case, base curve works quite well. This for example also, I think. But if you have the situations like that, like this one, it won't be too easy because you have already quite a lot of contrasts in the scene because of the sunny day, and to be able to see everything, I need to add a lot of exposure. Let's see how far I need to go to be able to see the details in the shadows. So this one is quite difficult to be able to deal only with a base curve. And as amateur photographer or as photographer, you have always, if you don't have that control over the lighting, you have always a lot of cases with this kind of lighting. And the problem is, if you add this curve to already high contrast photos, you are going 2 steps back before go to 1 step further. That doesn't make any sense to have the base curve on this one. And that's the one point. The second point is, if you're applying base curve, you're applying always the same look to every photo you have. So you're applying that base curve, and then you try to recover the problems that base curve gives you. That's the second thing. And third thing is, you train your look through that look that camera JPEG offers you, and you don't even photograph the scenes that doesn't fit in that kind of look. As example, this one, I could imagine if you have that that base curve here, that you will say, okay, my camera is not capable to do that. If I want to photograph this kind of scene, I need to use some other techniques like bracketing or whatever to be able to do that. Because if you add exposure, if you got in your camera, you will always go above the dynamic range if you want to see, for example, shadows there. And the very common problem is then, because of that, many of you are making mistake to go with exposure quite high by photographing and overexposing the highlights. So I will suggest to disable the tone curve, and if you have the possibility in your camera to have some kind of flat looking option, I will highly recommend to use that when you're shooting, because after that you have much more possibilities to be able to use your that dynamic range of your camera much better than just by that straight jacket like the base curve. Okay, let's say now you don't want to use that base curve, but you would like to use some kind of curve because you have practiced those kind of editing with other application, and you can very quickly get nice results with using of some kind of curve. And I will try to edit those 4-5 photos just with a tone curve to see how quick we can achieve a nice results. Okay, let's get started with the first one. Now we will also disable Filmic RGB, maybe remove that line there, and now use tone curve for further editing. And let's see, we are going here to the white point, bring maybe just a bit of contrast in the highlights and a bit of contrast in the shadows. And if I use independent channels, LAB, I can also add some saturation really quick. I don't know, doesn't need to be perfect now. but as you can see, we are very quick and quite effective. The last step may be local contrast. I don't know, maybe just a little bit less. I think I've gone too far here, but we are really quick. As you can see, only 2 points and we are practically done. Okay, let's try the next one. Now we have our grandma here, Filmic, disable Filmic, tone curve, a white point, a bit of contrast in the highlights, a bit of contrast in the shadows, something like that. Maybe also LAB curve. So, and the last step, local contrast, and we are finished. Quick and easy. The next one. Okay, Filmic RGB, turn off. We need a tone curve. Let's see, a white point. Is there something like that? We're adding a bit contrast. I don't think we need contrast in the shadows, so I can go immediately to saturation. Maybe just a tiny bit more. Let's say something like that. Okay, and local contrast, and we are done. So as before, turn the Filmic off, tone curve. Let's go, let's see where is the white point, somewhere here. And let's see, can we recover that shadows? I will say something like that. This one would not be easy, I can say. But experts, some of you are experts in this case, and I think you can be better than I here. I think this one is okay for our presentation, so let's go to the LAB version so that we can add saturation. And local contrast. And as you can see, only with tone curve, without base curve, you have much more possibilities, or you have much better results. And only with one curve, as you can see. Okay, the last one. So disabling Filmic, tone curve. Okay, we are here a little bit tight, so let's go to the exposure first. Bring that exposure down and try to adjust that with tone curve. I need a bit more contrast in the highlights. I don't know, maybe a bit, tiny bit. Let's bring that black point here. Tiny bit contrast in the shadows, not too much. It's not so easy. I could also, I think, use a shift button to bring those points up and down. Okay, LAB and saturation. and local contrast. And as you can see, quick and easy. It's really nice result without too much hassle. Okay, I think we need to go tiny bit back with exposure. I would say okay. And as you have seen, using of curves is quite effective. We only need to add a few points, and in 0 time we can have really nice results almost in any case. But similar to the base curve, in this case is when you have a lot of contrast. This can be tricky, but you have also another tools that you can use to improve that, so you don't need to use only tone curve for that. So you must say tone curve is quite nice and effective instrument for dealing with that adjustments of the photo. Now, could we in scene referred workflow have some possibility to be quite as effective as with curves without too much hassle? So let's see how can we deal with our photos in scene referred workflow. So since we won't use curves in a scene referred workflow, although we have that option with RGB curve, but I will suggest not to use it because it is much better to rethink your development process to the logic of the scene referred workflow, and for that you have other modules. I will say 3 main modules which can help you to achieve a quite nice high quality results, and if you are able to understand how to use them, you will be also able to get those results real quick. So that are Filmic RGB, color balance RGB, and tone equalizer. If you know those modules, you will have really quick and nice results. So let's get started with a Filmic. So before we start with Filmic, I would like to add some exposure to our photos so that we can see the details a bit better. And I will also like to explain how that waveform works, which I'm using. And I'm using it as a particular reason because I have here in horizontal axis practically a spatial representation of the pixels of the photo. So for example, those yellow leaves on that, I will say, a left part of the picture is represented here. And those green leaves you can see here. Maybe I will use another example, just a moment, because it's quite important. Let's use this photo. We can recognize things a bit better. As you can see, we have here 2 bright spots and our main subject, our model, and all 3 elements are represented here in waveform. These are those 2 bright spots, and this is our model here, as you can see. This is this one, and this one is that here. So you can see immediately what kind, what part of the image is have what kind of brightness, and that will be quite handy when we are dealing with these modules. Okay, let's go back and start the Filmic. Okay, we are now back to our first photo, and what I would like to say also is that in by our waveform, this dotted line is the border of our dynamic range, and if we go above that line we are clipping. And let's see how the Filmic looks like. We have that curve and we have three main areas here. I will try to show them. And we have here highlights, midtones, and shadows. That can be represented also here on the histogram. We have here roughly highlights, and I don't know, something like that here, midtones and shadows. And as you can also see, the compression is so that we have much higher compression in the highlights and in the shadows, and the mid part is mostly linear, although there is also compression, but not so much like in the highlights and the shadows. And if we want to have contrasts in our photo, we need to bring that part in that mid-gray. If you have some parts of the image that are in the highlights or high in the highlights, you will have difficulties with contrast, because there is the compression high, quite high, and you lose that contrast there. Okay, that is everything you need to know about that. So let's see how can we improve our photo here by using Filmic. Now we will turn off the Filmic to see the difference before and after. And I will also take a snapshot for that, so that we have that snapshot before we are turned off our Filmic. And now we will turn Filmic on and see before and after. And as you can see, that standard setting of Filmic gives us some contrasts in the shadows, but we are losing that contrast on here on the leaves, on the higher part of our dynamic range. And now we have some possibilities to cope with that. We have here two sliders, white relative exposure and black relative exposure. Now let's see what happens if I move that white relative exposure back. Please watch that photo, waveform, and that Filmic curve. You see what happens? If I'm moving that slider to the left, I'm widening that area in the mid-gray. But at the same time, I'm shifting that linear part towards the highlights. I will do that again. This is some kind of the axis for that up and down. You see that? Now, we can leave that there because we now have much more contrast on our photo, and we don't want to have too much contrast on the shadows, so we can go to the black relative exposure and bring that back. And as you can see, the compression is now much higher in the shadows, and we can see that we are losing that contrast in the shadows because we don't need too much there. And only with this move, I have already improved my photo quite a bit. Now, what has happened here? We have compressed with black relative exposure, we have compressed our blacks a bit more. With white relative exposure, we have relieved that compression from the midtones and also shifted that mid-gray towards highlights. Because we have now here in that area not so much compression because that linear part is quite high. Only small amount of compression is here. We have that contrasts in our area here back. So that means those leaves here are now a part of that mid-gray. That is everything that you need to know how to use the Filmic for this case. Okay, what can we do else? Now we are finished with the Filmic and we can use another module which I have used a lot of time in the last episode, always on the same way you can see. So that is our color balance RGB, and when I add a bit color intensity, I can use those two parts here, excuse me, to add even more contrast and have much control over the contrast in midtones and highlights, and also in shadows. So if you are adding perceptual saturation grading in the shadows, you're already adding some kind of contrast in that part and a bit in the midtones. And you can also use that perceptual brilliance grading for that. So for example, if I add some brilliance in the highlights, I'm going up also with highlights. So I will turn that back. Please watch this part of the waveform. What is happening? I will add vibrance and global chroma. These two parts are not changing any contrasts. But if I add now shadows here, I'm going down a little bit, and midtones, also in the midtones, you can see how that moves. And now I can add the highlights in the perceptual brilliance grading up, and I have now even more contrast in that area, which is interesting for us. Now, with these two modules, we have improved quite nicely that photo. Now I will add as last step, I will add just a little bit of local contrast, and I will use diffuse and sharpen because that is one of the modules that works in that scene referred workflow. You will have it in the next version of the Darktable. You can use local contrast for that, but I would like to use that one. And I have also the preset for that, so we don't need to lose too much time there. Something like that. It's maybe too much. Let's correct that. And as you can see, we have now only with those two modules quite nice photo. And I will say it is even better than our tone curve. So let's see how that looks. Let's go to that is the base curve. I will add snapshot. That is now our tone curve. Also add snapshot, and we will see how that looks in comparison. So this is our base curve. This is our tone curve. As you can see, we have much better look than of both of them. Okay, with tone curve and base curve we are really quick, but here we are also quick. Not so quick as, for example, with tone curve, but we have quite nice result with only few moves. Now you can also use color balance. As you can see, I am always using the same sliders here. I can also add make that as preset, and I will be real quick. But I don't want to do that now because I would like to demonstrate how that works. Now let's try the next photo with that. Now we have our grandma here. I will first add a bit exposure there, maybe not too much, a bit less or something like that. And now I can use Filmic like in the last photo. So I will bring back that black relative exposure so that we have much more compression in the shadows, but also we have the brighter shadow parts. And I can use white relative exposure to bring that midtones a bit brighter, so to relieve that compression, and also use RGB balance, color balance RGB, always the same things, maybe not too much saturation there. And last step, diffuse and sharpen, local contrast, maybe a bit less. And we are done. You can see it looks quite nice. I don't want to watch how it looks in comparison to other. Let's go just to the next one real quick because this one could be interesting. We are going with exposure a bit up, and now we can use like relative exposure, and I don't think that we need too much with white relative exposure because we have enough contrast there. You know, we will add that contrast with color balance RGB, as you can see, really quick, maybe something like that. And if we add at the end that local contrast, we are done. Quite nice. We have all details in every part of the image and also in the clouds. And let's try the next one. That will be real interesting. So because this one had also a lot of contrast, now we will add exposure a tiny bit, maybe something like that. And we have quite a lot of contrast in the shadows, so we go to Filmic, black relative exposure up. But that is not enough. We can now use white relative exposure to add even more compression, as you can see. When we add even more compression, we have also a much more definition in the shadows here, as you can see. But we can now add a tiny bit more exposure, and if we are using our color balance RGB, we can cope with that low contrast in the highlights, or in highlights in the midtones, just by adding that perceptual saturation grading and also perceptual brilliance grading, something like that. And of course, as last step, local contrast, and we have quite nice picture. And we have a lot of details in the shadows. And the last one. So I don't think we need to add some exposure here. And I also don't think that we need to play with Filmic here because we have already a nice start point. I will only try to use color balance here and see do we get that result that we want. And I will say, of course, we have that because if we need more of contrast, we can also use that 4 ways tab and go to the highlights gain and give it a bit more. You see how that we can go quite far here. And diffuse and sharpen as for local contrast, maybe not too much, just a bit less. And we have perfect contrast here. Okay, this is the one way. I would like to show you another way which you can use for improve that contrast in the highlights by using tone equalizer. Okay, now I will add a little bit exposure here so that we can see our photo a bit better. But I don't want to go too far because I need that room here for enhancing that contrast in the highlights. And I will use now tone equalizer for that. And as you know, tone equalizer have that option that you need to adjust that internal mask in the middle. And normally is also, we have also here the preservation of details. But in this case, I will turn the mask on so you can see what is going on. We don't need that preservation of details here. We are going to disable that function so that we have practically some kind of a black and white version of our photo. And now we can shift that mask up and down on the dynamic range. And we need to know what kind of area is for our interest, and that is that upper part, practically that one. That needs to be enhanced, so we don't need to mask everything. We only need to know that this part is clearly achievable with those points. So we need to adjust that mask so that we have that highest parts of the brightness represented here in that histogram. For example, to know what I'm talking about, when I have the mask like that, I cannot achieve those parts here. So I need to bring it back so that I have enough room to work with the highlights. So if I have adjusted that mask here by a mask exposure compensation, I can see with the mouse which area need to be influenced. For example, I'm going through those yellow leaves and maybe a bit more darker parts, and I will say we will need to influence only this part here, and everything is covered. We don't have any highlights which are shooting above that range. So we have enough points here for influencing our contrast, and now we'll do that by disabling, of course, that mask. And we are starting with the highest highlights, going up. Let's see. And we're already adding that contrast, maybe a bit back here. Let's go even more up. See how I'm adjusting that contrast. Now, if the area is too tight, I can also go back to the masking and bring that just a bit down. But I don't need that. It's quite enough. So let's go even further. Something like that. Now I have enough contrast in that area, as you can see. And now we can also use color balance to improve it just a bit more. Simple things like, that I have already used before, so nothing new. And now the last step will be add some local contrast, and we are practically done. I can also add a bit saturation here. So as you can see, we have influenced only this part, and bring that up so that we have that enough contrast on that area. So let's do that also with the next photos. So we have here our grandma. I'm adding a little bit of exposure, maybe a bit more, so that we have everything covered here. Maybe I will just bring back that black relative exposure so that we have that shadows a bit brighter. And now I will use tone equalizer, masking, disable preservation of details so that we have that black-white version. And now I'm watching, do I cover everything? Because we need to cover only the highlights here. I think I don't. Yeah, so that's this area is problematic. So I need to go to mask exposure compensation. I can now try that automatically to adjust that automatically, but I can also go manually there, because I want enough room here in this area, so I don't have a problem to go even further back. Maybe something like that, and I have enough room now to adjust that contrast in the highlights. Okay, turn that mask off, and let's see how can we improve our grandma. And I think we're done. You see? Color balance, just a tiny bit. We need some intensity. And last step is diffuse and sharpen. And we are finished. Okay, let's try the next one. Exposure, tiny bit. I don't think that we need too much here, but let's try that also. Maybe also tiny bit of black relative exposure so that we have a bit more brightness in the shadows and not so high contrasts. And we will use tone equalizer real quick. No, bring it in the middle and watch what it looks like. I think we have enough room, so go up. I don't think we need too much more. We are good here. Just to improve a little bit of that clouds and of course color balance as always. And diffuse and sharpen. We are finished here. This one. Exposure. No, this one will be a bit difficult because we have already a lot of contrasts here. So we need to adjust that compression bit a little bit. So we go back with black relative exposure and maybe add even more from white relative exposure, because we are getting even more details here in the shadows. But we are also compressed the highlights quite a lot, as you can see, but we have enough room to improve that. So we go now use tone equalizer. Let's adjust our mask first, disable that preservation of details, and let's see how our mask look like. I think we need to go a bit to the left. Let's see. This area is something like that. No, we don't have complete area dynamic range here in that histogram, but it is not necessary. That is the point. The point is that I have everything covered what I need for enhancing that contrast. Okay, so turn off the mask and let's play with our sliders. Highest first and so on. We can go even further. I don't know, maybe just a bit contrast in this area. And we're nice here. As you can see, we are only influenced, I would say, mid-grays and the upper half of mid-grays and highlights. And you can recognize that also in our waveform. And after that, we need some improvement here. And last step, and we're done. Okay, last one. So we don't have too much room here for improvement, but we also don't need too much. If I need too much more room, I can go back with our exposure here and go with diffusion, maybe also turn that black relative exposure back for the details in the shadows. And now I can use tone equalizer, adjust that mask, disable preservation of details, and see, okay, this area is not covered here, so we need to go with compensation back. Let's see, now we're covering that, but I will go even more. Let's see, something like that. And what are the areas? So now we have to deal with areas from here to there, and disable the mask, and we're going up. As you can see, we are adding quite nicely that contrast. Don't know, maybe a bit more, and not too much. I don't want to go too far, it's not necessary. So let's see, let's look nice. I don't want to lose the details, for example, on the skirt of the woman, and that's okay. Color balance, and diffuse and sharpen nodes for local contrast. Not too much, a bit less. And we're done. Again, just to demonstrate how much room you need if you have that flat look. You need about, I don't know, from here to there if you have a flat looking photo, and you can organize that by using Filmic and compress or decompress your dynamic range to have enough of that room there. If you don't have enough of room, you can also use tone equalizer, one other instance, on bring that highlights back, but with using of that preservation of details, and then use another instance to add some contrast back. That will work also quite well. Okay, I think that is enough for today. If you have any questions, please ask in the comment area, or even better, go to the pixels.us and we can discuss those problems or questions there. So thank you for watching, and until the next time.